Hello, everyone. I am Seymen Atasoy from the Eastern Mediterranean University in North Cyprus. My talk for today is entitled Idealism in Consciousness Studies, Dominant Cultural Narratives and Social Change. My starting point is the existence of the enduring puzzles in science, such as why is there still no generally accepted materialist explanations for consciousness, the quantum anomalies of the last 100 years, the mind-body problem, and the heart problem. Another puzzling situation is the long-standing stagnation in social sciences, and especially in more recent times, irrational developments in politics and society are taking place for which there are, as of yet, no satisfying explanations. Also, it may be worthy at this stage to remember that Newtonian physics is the original model for social science, and this brings to mind the question, is materialism causing stagnation in social science disciplines? An important clarification is necessary to distinguish political and ethical idealism from philosophical or metaphysical idealism. These are two different views. In politics, the word idealism etymologically was made up from ideals, whereas in philosophy, actually the important root word is ideas. And these are two very different approaches. If you look at the Cambridge Dictionary, for instance, ideal is defined as perfect or the best possible thing or situation. And this could be anything and could be used to justify, for example, genocide, to attain the ideal of racial purity if somebody defines his or her ideal as racism or racist. Whereas in philosophy, of course, idealism refers to a situation where ideas, mind, or consciousness is the ground of all being, and everything else, including matter, is derivative of it. And can there be a political idealism without metaphysics? Of course, that shouldn't be the case, but oftentimes political idealists don't define their metaphysical fundamental principles not very clearly. Their assumptions are not very clearly articulated. So political and ethical idealists should clarify their metaphysical position and remain consistently loyal to it. One example here in this screen, we have the paper by Cameron Thies assessing the realist-idealist debate in international relationships. And the argument here is that this realist-idealist debate, which is in a way reminiscent of the materialist-idealist debate in a way, but of course different, but there is some overlapping points here. This debate was framed by the realists, not by the idealists themselves, according to this argument, but by the realists who constructed a unified idealism temporarily located in the interwar period to be the straw man for the justification of their own theories and the starting point for the construction of the realist identity. Another distinction we need to make is the distinction between rational actors and conscious actors. A lot of social science makes the rational actor assumption. In economics, economic actors are rational utility maximizers. Corporations are rational profit maximizers. In international relations, states are rational power maximizers. And but instead of a rational actor, if the more important actor is the conscious actor, then that's much more difficult to define, and it's much more difficult to predict the behavior of a conscious actor because it's not just intelligence, but there are emotions in consciousness, and memories and qualia have unpredictable effects sometimes on conscious actors. So perhaps this is one of the shortcomings of social sciences, because these rational choice models based on expected utility often disappoint. Especially in more recent times, we have a lot of irrational developments in especially politics, with authoritarian populism manipulating the emotions of angry and resentful masses for their own political interests. And there is also a long-standing dissatisfaction with materialism and a search for alternatives in social sciences. During the last 30 years, we had these competing paradigms: post-positivism, interpretivism, reflexivism, social constructivism, etc. But still, realism, more materialistic realism, remains the dominant paradigm and discourse in social sciences in general. And social sciences are also quite conservative and resistant to change. Here is an example whereby the American Political Science Association president of the 1920s calls upon his colleagues to decipher and integrate the insights from the quantum revolution and apply it to the social sciences, but this request doesn't take place until recently, whereby an eminent political scientist, Alexander Wendt, applied the quantum paradigm and panpsychism to social science and started a lively debate. His book came out from Cambridge University Press in 2015. If we assess the situation by using Thomas Kuhn's cycle for the scientific revolutions, we see that if at all, we are at the very beginning stages of a potential paradigm change in science. So a lot of modesty is called for. Materialism is still very strong. Some examples of recent initiatives for post-materialist science. In the United States, a group of university professors and scholars, scientists announced the manifesto for a post-materialist science to overcome the constraints of materialism. And it's also important that they note that compassion, respect, and peace, as well as environmental awareness and the preservation of our biosphere, are actually associated with an idealistic or idealist vision. From the United Kingdom, we have an example of the Galileo Commission report, Beyond the Materialist Worldview Towards an Expanded Science. They call for expanding science so that it can accommodate and explore important human experiences and questions that science in its present form is unable to integrate. Another noteworthy academic is Bernardo Kastrup, who's got 2 PhDs in computer science and philosophy, and he has been publishing both in academic journals, but also at the same time he's been publishing books appealing to the general public. So I call Kastrup and others like him dual track scholars that both appeal to the general public as well as the scientific community. And also Kastrup gave me the idea regarding the importance of cultural narratives, because he claims that he would like to change the cultural narrative by defending philosophical or metaphysical idealism. His version he calls analytic idealism. A dominant cultural narrative is an explanation or story that is told in service of the dominant social group's interests and ideologies. Because dominant narratives are so normalized through their repetition and authority, they have the illusion of being objective and apolitical, when in fact they are neither. Here is a small sketch that shows how cultural narratives shape our lens of meaning through which we gaze at the world and interpret the reality around ourselves. A political science argument concerning the importance of cultural differences is here presented as an example. Samuel Huntington, the late political scientist from Harvard University, published his books and papers on the clash of civilizations in the 1990s and afterwards, after the end of the Cold War. And he argued that after the end of ideological conflict with the end of Cold War, civilizations and civilizational differences would be the source of future conflict in world politics. Other than cultural identities, There are also different collective identities based on nationalism, ethnicity, race, ideology, and historical enmity, and serve as major sources of conflict in domestic and international politics, genocide, war, populism, etc. And idealism is likely to moderate conflictual identity politics and support cooperation by expanding collective identities towards the whole of existence and by instilling long-term thinking. The importance of having a long-term perspective was emphasized by Robert Axelrod. He used evolutionary game theory to explain the importance of what he calls the shadow of the future, having a long time perspective to stabilize cooperation. Idealism extends the time horizon of humans infinitely. In fact, perhaps this could be called the secularization of immortality and oneness. So basically, the argument is natural science influences both social science and cultural narrative, and a social science influenced by natural science also influences cultural narrative, and a change in cultural narrative is likely to bring about change in the actual social, political, economic order. Expanded science is also likely to moderate and help resolve the ongoing conflict between secularism and religion. Although there is a global decline of religion in general during the last decade, still religion is tenacious, and the idealist interpretation of reality actually threatens not only materialists but fundamentalist religions also. So both atheists, materialists, as well as the fundamentalist religionists are likely to oppose idealism. In fact, they already do that. Famous historian Yuval Noah Harari here defines religion as a deal and spirituality as a journey. And also it's worth to keep in mind that organized religion is often dominated by the state or voluntarily collaborates with it, serving centralization of power within the society at the expense of individuals, whereas spirituality is based on direct experience rather than officially sanctioned scripture and clergy, and is less open to political and economic manipulation by existing and would-be leaders. I mentioned this distinction between religion and spirituality because philosophical idealism, at least implicitly, supports spirituality but not religion. Not so much religion. In fact, contradicts religion, because oftentimes, especially the monotheistic religions, Western religions, are dualistic between a God in heavens and sinful humans here on this planet, and there is this duality, whereas spirituality is often based on non-duality or oneness, and also idealism calls for a oneness of consciousness as the ground of all being. Here is a recent statistical piece showing the decline of religion. Of course, we have to keep in mind it still remains to be an important social force. Briefly, let's look at some examples for academic receptivity to and desire for a new worldview reminiscent of idealism. Two Duke University psychologists published this paper, The Psychological Implications of Believing That Everything is One. Their research is based on survey research, and in two studies they found that believing in oneness was associated with having an identity that includes distal people and the natural world, feeling connected to humanity and nature, and having values that focus on other people's welfare. That sounds pretty good in terms of cooperation and pro-social behavior. Another study from prestigious journal Millennium International Relations calls for an idealist vision for world politics. And here some psychologists from University of Arizona and Harvard University call for a post-materialist psychology, and ecological economics published this article exploring worldviews and their relationship to sustainable lifestyles also calling for an idealist vision. These were just some examples. However, there are also major risks if idealism becomes popular too rapidly and in an unbalanced manner. I have seen a lot of studies in the literature defending the benefits of idealism for human civilization, but I haven't seen any warnings that it may have also certain unexpected and harmful consequences if it comes to dominate the cultural narrative too rapidly and in an unbalanced way. Because if consumption drops too abruptly in a capitalist society, the economy will collapse, unemployment will rise, food distribution may be disrupted, and social disorder may ensue. If only some groups within a society or only some countries in the global system adopt idealism as a guide to behavior, they will face the risk of subjugation, exploitation, and conquest by others still aggressively materialistic. After all, let's keep in mind, politics is a power game. Potential losers and potential winners, whenever you have them associated with change, expect the conflict. There will be continued resistance to idealism by those who stand to lose their privileged positions due to post-materialist ontologies, especially within the scientific establishment, but also in the economy, business, politics, and culture. This will permit only a gradual paradigm change in science and a still slower process of culture change in the broader society. On the other hand, the renaissance in psychedelic research and the mindfulness movement are two key accelerators of a potential acceptance of post-materialism. The spread of a consciousness-only ontology will increase pro-social behavior and cooperation, but there will be powerful losers, such as authoritarian states, centralized religions, many businesses and workers, consumers, and anyone engaged in the production and sale of non-vital goods and services. States will worry about their declining tax revenues and recruitment to their armies of patriotic citizens ready to kill and die. Companies need obedient employees and acquisitive customers to maximize their profits. I mean, of course, the argument behind these observations here is if the overall culture becomes more idealist, they will emphasize less material consumption, and maybe they will focus on exploration of their inner selves and maybe embark upon searches for meaning instead of just maximizing their income and focusing on material consumption. Here is a brief sketch showing the structure of a cultural narrative, and some examples are given from the environmental movement as well as the so-called MAGA narrative, Make America Great Again. So these are some examples, but once the dominant narrative is destabilized by competing narratives, that's another stage to be careful, because it's not assured that a progressive outcome will come from the destabilization of the dominant narrative. Another one supporting the status quo may emerge, and worse yet, a more regressive narrative may also emerge. An example from Finland, Erkka Laininen. So I have to rush a little bit time-wise, but she shows us that if you want to change the worldview, you have to focus on metaphysics and cosmology, which is at the basis. And also she criticizes the worldview in Western culture, atomistic and mechanistic, fragmented, positivistic and reductionist conception of knowledge and sciences, emphasis on material production and consumption, economic growth, globalization, and the like. And she comes from a more ecological, socialist perspective, and she presents here the dominant cultural narrative and her proposed new cultural narrative. She proposes things like we should shift from material consumption, individualism, and a focus on our on the needs of our generation to non-material consumption, sharing and caring, needs of future generations, and the like. So to conclude, in the last couple minutes I have, currently post-materialism remains to be a marginal position in natural and social science, despite growing interest in it. Being closer to materialism, panpsychism seems to be more acceptable to mainstream scientists than idealism is. Unless major new anomalies weaken materialism, a paradigm shift to post-materialism in science remains to be a long-term prospect at best. Rather than a monolithic paradigm shift, more diversity and pluralism leading to gradual change in science is more realistic and perhaps more preferable, as long as it's not too late for such a change. The COVID-19 pandemic has so far raised societal respect for mainstream sciences, especially the health-related ones. On the other hand, ecological decline, economic disparities, increasing conflict, the crisis of meaning, and other ills increase public demand for a viable alternative to materialism. Given the survey results confirming global decline of religion, public demand for a meaningful secular worldview is likely to increase. Scientists with a dual-track approach of communicating with the general public through popular writing and social media, while at the same time publishing scientific work, are highly impactful. If idealism smoothly becomes the next dominant cultural narrative of human civilization before it causes its own demise, it may help humanity to avoid further clashes of civilizations, overcome the ongoing and harmful conflict between secularism and religion, effectively respond to the rapidly deepening ecological crisis, reduce wars and other types of violence, increase international cooperation in many issue areas to create a better world and create harmonious, egalitarian, and meaningful societies, maximizing human wellness and growth, while reducing crime, corruption, and exploitation. One warning here, there are fake and dangerous political idealists, because, as we said, a political ideal can be anything that is assumed to be so. Corrupt and anti-democratic power elites legitimize their rule by ideology, religion, dynasty, or defense against imaginary enemies, which they present as ideals and prey upon their own societies. Authoritarian and parasitic populist leaders and their supporters falsely claim to be democratic and to represent the interests of masses, while actually deceiving and exploiting them. Religionists frequently cause sectarian and antagonistic divisions of societies while abusing the ideals of their religion as cover. Racists attack minorities in the name of their ideal of racial purity. Nationalists suppress ethnic minorities in the name of national unity. And imperialists seek to capture and exploit resources of foreign countries in the name of glory and grandeur. Finally, recommendations are: ethical, sociological, and political idealists should double-check and clarify their own understanding, their own underlying metaphysical assumptions. Harmony with metaphysical idealism can serve as a criterion by which the depth of ethical and political idealism is assessed. Primary ethical political principles metaphysical idealism implies are: 1. Respect for oneness of being, subscribe to nonviolence and seek to eradicate violence everywhere, uphold human rights, ecological stewardship, animal rights, biodiversity, etc. And 2, don't divide human communities at any level from local to global in the name of race, gender, religion, sect, nationalism, ethnocentrism, ideology, etc. So beware of opportunistic political leaders pretending to be idealists but grossly contradicting metaphysical idealism. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll appreciate if you have some comments or suggestions for me. My email address is indicated on this slide, and I wish all of you a very nice conference, dear friends. Have a good life, and may all beings be happy.